So to start off with, I think we can't possibly talk about contributions of Black people without talking about some of the really big contributions made in the First and the Second World War. And it's really particularly important just because it has been whitewashed from history. I personally don't remember learning about it. I mean, if you learned about Black people's contributions in the First and Second World War, can you click put your thumbs up to say if you have learned about it? Any responses, Monique?
7 responses.
Yeah, I mean, and interestingly, about 2 years back, I was conducting an assembly. Well, I normally would have conducted an assembly with my year 10 group, and one of the senior leaders decided to conduct the assembly instead because it was remembrance. We went through an entire remembrance assembly without once mentioning, and bearing in mind it's a school in Hackney, it's very, very multi-ethnic, children from all different parts of the world, and never once did she mention anything about contributions made by other people from other countries that would have been probably part of the empire. And you know, you could literally see the children's eyes glazing over, because for them it's got nothing to do with them as far as they're concerned. And I'm sure had she said, well, actually, and she'd named some countries that they could probably relate to or that their families are from, they would have understood the importance of this. So yeah, education is absolutely key. Yeah. So if we look at what happened, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, got a comment. Dave mentioned in New Zealand we learnt about the Maori battalion and their contributions.
Oh, wow. Okay, amazing. So we could take a leaf out of New Zealand, but definitely. So by the end of World War, by the end of the November 1918, by the time the First World War had finished, 15,204 Black men had served under the British West Indies Regiment. And by the end of the war, about 185 soldiers were killed, and a further over 1,000 had died of illness, and approximately 697 were wounded. And then throughout the war, about 60,000 Black South Africans, another 120,000 other Africans who also served in uniformed labour units contributed to, and this is just Britain we're talking about. So obviously Black people contributed to armies for other countries as well, but we're just specifically focusing on Britain. And then approximately 7,850 servicemen, so that's Black African servicemen, were killed. Were killed. And then 127,000 men in the labour units were killed as well. And a lot of these men were buried in unmarked graves. So there's a documentary that David Lammy did on Channel 4. I think it's still on there if you wanted to watch it on Catch Up, which talks in detail about this. And you know, it was obviously, you know, it's a very sort of big scandal that this has happened, that these people are still not commemorated today. And at the time, the War Office actually went to great lengths to keep weapons out of the hands of the West Indians and the Africans, making them largely into labour battalions, because there was such a fear of what Black people might do should they be fighting with weapons. Because it is, you know, in one way it contradicts the idea of Black people being, you know, very, you know, simple. They're not able to cope with modern weaponry. They're not intelligent enough. And at the same time, you know, should they then, you know, prove that they are the opposite, and that then it would say, oh, well, they're equal to any sort of white Englishman. And that kind of idea was absolutely something that the War Office and the government themselves just did not want to perpetrate. And even during the mid-war manpower crisis, when soldiers were needed, every effort was made to keep numbers of Black volunteers as low as possible. The battalions were segregated. And then, of course, as I said, they weren't allowed to fight any Europeans in battle at all. And if they did fight, they actually fought other Africans or other Black soldiers fighting on the other side. That's the only way that eventually they were allowed to fight. And then, of course, there were racist treatments of Black servicemen during and after the war, and even after their contributions were hidden from public, as we said before in I think last session, that, for example, all of the parades and photographs and contributions, all of that was whitewashed, completely hidden from the public. So public didn't know the contributions by Black people. And even till today, there's still lots of people that don't know the contributions. And then the other thing that ended up happening was that, you know, Black people, not only were they given menial tasks to do during the war itself, like laying telephone lines, loading ammunitions, digging trenches, they also received lower pay than white Englishmen. And definitely they could not become officers or, as I said, fight. Any pay rises were denied, but they were also given to English white military men. And the other thing that happened is after the war was over, one of the things they made them sort of wash the laundry of the white servicemen. They made them clean their latrines, for example. And one of the things, of course, eventually that happened was that the Black men decided to, you know, decide they're not going to cooperate anymore, and this led to one squad being tried for mutiny, and the leaders being sentenced to 3 to 5 years. And in one case, one of the men was sentenced to 21 years, and another one was shot. So yeah, it was the segregation was very much, you know, kept under control, and Black people kept in their place, if you like. Another Black soldier and who lived in Britain and served with British forces was a man called Eustace Roane. Now, there were anomalies to the rules. So although officially Black people were not supposed to be fighting alongside white people, there was so much confusion in the War Office about where people were supposed to be. So if you were a Black person born in this country, often they didn't know where to place you. So some of them were placed with the BWIR, some of them were placed with segregated units of just Black people from Britain. Some of them were placed with white British soldiers. So there was lots of confusion. So Eustace Roane was placed with the Welsh Regiment, and he was deployed to France. And he's one of the people, unfortunately, that died of gas poisoning and was injured on the battlefield. And he's just an example of some Black men who did get to fight on the front lines and who did make that contribution and fought alongside white comrades. But they still faced discrimination whilst they were on the front lines and when they actually returned home. And in fact, my dad actually was in the army for 6 years, and he's about 67 now, and this is back in the 70s. And he said that, yeah, discrimination was rife, and it was quite common, you know, to be racially abused and people to try and push you around. So, you know, that sort of racial abuse that was happening back in the beginning of the 20th century hasn't gone away. One of the newspapers in 1915 said that a number of coloured men had lately presented themselves to enlistment in any of the services at Glamorgan headquarters, recruiting office in Queen Street. But up to the present, recruiting Sergeant Ashton has been reluctantly compelled to decline their services. So sometimes they were declined on the basis that they supposedly had poor health, even though in fact, not just some, but quite a lot of the working class white men had really, really, really poor health, and they still ended up being recruited into the army. Another example was Walter Tull, and he was born in Kent in 1888, and he grew up in an orphanage and was a professional football player. So he actually became the first officer in the British Army, despite the rules saying that no Black man can become an officer. So he was promoted in 1917 to lieutenant, but this happened out on the field. So those rules were sort of at the discretion of the commanding officers, and he died whilst leading a battle an attack in the Battle of Somme. And his commanding officer recommended him for a military cross for bravery. And if we look, we fast forward onto the Second World War, we can see there an increase in the women actually that were contributing as well. So around 6,000 West Indians served with the Royal Air Force and Royal Canadian Air Force in roles from fighter pilots to bomb aimers, air gunners to ground staff and administration. And of these, well over 100 were women who were posted overseas. In Britain, 350 were employed to work in munitions factories, and around 700 lumberjacks came from British Honduras, which is modern day Belize, and Central America, and were recruited to work in the forests of Scotland. And actually they were asked to stay at the end of the war to settle. So a lot of them ended up staying and settling in Scotland. Approximately 16,000 West Indians volunteered for service alongside the British during the Second World War. And in 1940, 1,800 men had responded to an appeal from that should be the Commonwealth Office, sorry, apologies for that, to serve as the crew for the cargo ship of a merchant navy. In addition, you have 370,000 Africans who also fought for Britain, and they came from mainly areas of West and East Africa, so it would have been the British colonies, and fought in several theatres during the Second World War. And there were also quite a large number of Black people that would have been sent over to East and West Africa and to parts of Southeast Asia to fight the Japanese as well. And one of the reasons people often ask, why did people volunteer? You know, after the treatment that they'd had in the First World War, after the discrimination that demobilised soldiers faced after the First World War, which we talked about the other week, why did people go back and volunteer again? And there's a myriad of different reasons. So some people, who's been interviewed, they said, well, we volunteered because we felt like the Nazis were the British Empire was preferable to a Nazi controlled world. Some of them believed themselves to be loyal British subjects, which is what they'd been taught all of their lives, and they thought they were coming to help the motherland. But and also some of them fought because they felt like, well, it was their chance to prove, and this also applies to First World War as well, it was their chance to prove that they were just as good as any Englishman. Okay, that was, a common sort of belief. And lots of sort of leaders, political leaders in the various colonial countries felt that this was also a way to show, well, actually, we can govern ourselves, and if we fight for you, then you should give us independence at the end of the Second World War. So there's also that consideration to take into account. And during the Second World War, the colour bar was also relaxed. And one of the reasons why the colour bar was relaxed was very much because it was a contradiction. So you can't very well have a British army fighting a racist fascist force when you're behaving in a racist manner yourself. So in order to sort of make it, I suppose, publicity-wise look good, and also to improve the numbers of manpower, they relaxed some of these colour bar rules, which meant that more people were able to join, and also meant that more people were Black people were recruited into positions of being officers. And one of the anomalies to this colour bar also was the RAF. So the RAF in particular was much less strict about their colour bar rules. So that gave the opportunity to quite a lot of our servicemen from the Caribbean, from Africa, to become actual airmen fighting and flying and fighting. This is a picture here that shows 500 West Indian RAF airmen. And you have also a lady called Lillian Bader, who was born in Liverpool. So she's half Irish and half, I can't remember now if she was from Caribbean or African background, but she was born in this country anyway, and born in England. Whoops. And she joined the army, but soon was sacked because of her colour, her colonial colour, which is what they often like to say. They would never say your black colour, they would always say your colonial colour. That's the problem. And her father had also been in the Navy, so she wanted to follow in his footsteps. And despite the discrimination she faced, when she did join the RAF, she became an engineer, a mechanic, and a leading aircraft woman in the RAF. And then she became one of the first women to become a corporal. Then you have a man called Johnny Smythe. Now, he was one of the first West Africans who became an RAF airman in World War II, and he successfully navigated 26 bombing missions over Germany before being shot down on his 27th mission. And it was the Germans who found him were actually quite shocked to see a black man had been flying the plane, because again, it goes against their ideologies. And he spent the next 2 years in a POW camp. And lots of these, the Black volunteers would have been stationed not just in England, they would have been stationed all over the world in different places. And, their contributions, again, were what was really, really useful to Britain in helping to defeat the Nazis. But unfortunately, at the end of the Second World War, the dream, or let's say the hope that they would gain independence in the colonial countries actually didn't come true. And when they eventually got independence, it was more because Britain economically and militarily just didn't have the power to hang on to their colonies any longer.